The parables of Jesus: grace, love, and compassion. The sun rises gently over the hills of Galilee, its first rays caressing the peaceful waters of the lake. A light breeze ripples through the fields of ripe wheat. It's in this pastoral setting that we find Jesus, surrounded by his disciples and an attentive crowd. Today, my dear friends, we're going to dive into the depths of 3 parables that have the power to revolutionize our understanding of love, grace, and compassion. Imagine yourself there, sitting in the cool grass, your gaze fixed on this extraordinary teacher. His eyes shine with age-old wisdom, and yet he speaks with the simplicity of a village storyteller. Today, Jesus will share stories that, although simple in appearance, contain truths capable of transforming lives. Jesus begins his story. Kingdom of Heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire workers for his vineyard. His voice carries far, captivating his audience from the very first words. He describes how the owner goes out at different times of the day to hire workers. Some start early in the morning, others at noon, and the last work only an hour at the end of the day. But when it comes time for payment, a surprising scene unfolds. The owner gives each worker the same wage, starting with the last ones hired. You can almost feel the tension rising in the air. First workers, those who have worked all day under the scorching sun, approach confidently, expecting to receive more. But to their great surprise, they receive exactly the same amount as those who worked only an hour. Naturally, complaints arise. These who were hired last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the work and the heat of the day. You can almost see the sweat on their brows, hear the indignation in their voices. The owner's response is revealing. Friend, I am not being unfair to you. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Take your pay and go. I want to give the one who was hired last the same as I gave you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? Or are you envious because I am generous? Imagine the silence that falls over the crowd at these words. Jesus has just overturned all their notions of justice and fairness. This parable teaches us several profound truths about God's grace. God's generosity. God is more generous than we can imagine. His grace goes beyond our logic of merit. Equality in the kingdom. In God's kingdom, the last will be first. God doesn't show favoritism based on length or intensity of service. God's sovereignty. God is free to dispense his grace as he sees fit. You have no right to question his generosity. The danger of envy. Parable warns against envy and resentment towards God's goodness to others. Let's take a moment to reflect. How often have we felt injustice in the face of God's kindness towards others? Perhaps we've judged someone as less deserving of divine grace. This parable invites us to rejoice in God's grace, even when it's given to those we consider less deserving. In our modern world, how could we apply this parable? Imagine a longtime Christian joyfully welcoming a new convert without resentment for the lost years, or a church celebrating the return of a wayward member without judging their past, or a believer rejoicing in another's success rather than envying it. The message is clear. God's grace is a gift, not a wage. It can't be earned, only received with gratitude. What liberation! What joy to know that we are all equal in God's eyes, all beneficiaries of his unmerited grace. Jesus continues with one of his most famous parables. There was a man who had 2 sons. The words resonate in the air, and you can almost see the faces in the crowd light up with recognition. It's a story that touches the very heart of the human condition. He tells the story of a younger son who asks for his share of the inheritance, a scandalous request equivalent to wishing his father dead. Yet the father grants his request. The son leaves home and squanders everything in wild living. You can almost sense the silent judgment of the crowd towards this ungrateful son. But then fortune turns. A famine strikes the land, and the son finds himself in utter misery. Reduced to feeding pigs, the ultimate degradation for a Jew, he even longs to eat the animal's food. It's then that he makes a decision. Return to his father, ready to be treated as a mere servant. The scene that follows is one of the most moving in all of Scripture. A father, seeing his son from afar, is filled with compassion. He runs to meet him, unthinkable for a respectable man of the time, embraces him, and organizes a great feast to celebrate his return. You can almost hear the whispers of surprise in the crowd. This is not how an offended father should act. But the story doesn't end there. The older son, hearing the music and dancing, refuses to enter the house. His anger is palpable. "Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours who has squandered your property with prostitutes comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him." The father's response is full of love and wisdom. "My son, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." This parable reveals several profound aspects of God's love. Unconditional love. The Father loves both his sons, no matter what they do. His love is not based on their behavior. The joy of forgiveness. The Father celebrates the prodigal son's return, showing that forgiveness is not just absolution, but joyful restoration. Freedom of choice. The Father allows his Son to leave, showing that God's love respects our freedom, even when we make bad choices. Excessive generosity. The Father's reaction exceeds all expectations, reflecting God's overflowing grace. Challenge of forgiveness. The older son's reaction shows us how difficult it can be to accept God's grace towards those we judge unworthy. Let's take a moment to reflect. Which character in this story do we identify with most? Are we the prodigal son, needing to return to the Father, or the older son, needing to learn to rejoice in the grace given to others? In our modern world, how could this parable apply? Imagine parents welcoming with open arms a child who has cut ties for years. Or a community celebrating the rehabilitation of a former delinquent. Or someone forgiving a person who has caused them great harm. The message is powerful. God's love is always ready to welcome, forgive, and restore. What hope does this give us in our own lives? Jesus now begins his final parable of the day. The atmosphere is electric, everyone eagerly awaiting what the Master will say. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. Jesus begins. You can almost see the winding, dangerous road in the minds of the listeners. He was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. The silence is total. Everyone knows the dangers of this road and can identify with this unfortunate man. Jesus continues. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, passed by on the other side. You can almost hear the murmurs of disapproval in the crowd. Priest, a man of God, passing by without helping? So too a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. The indignation rises. Two religious men, supposed to be examples of piety, have ignored a man in need. Then comes the turning point of the story. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. You can almost feel the shock in the audience. Samaritan? Jews and Samaritans were long-standing enemies. No one expected a Samaritan to be the hero of this story. Jesus describes in detail the Samaritan's actions. He approaches, bandages the wounded man's wounds, pours oil and wine on them, puts him on his own donkey, takes him to an inn, and cares for him. The next day, he even pays the innkeeper to continue caring for the man, promising to reimburse any extra expense on his return. Jesus' conclusion is powerful. Which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The answer is obvious, even if it's hard for some to admit, the one who had mercy on him. This parable teaches us several important truths about loving our neighbor. Compassion transcends barriers. The Samaritan, despised by the Jews, is the one who shows compassion, defying social and religious prejudices. Love in action. The Samaritan's compassion translates into concrete, costly, and committed acts. Redefining neighbor. Jesus broadens the definition of neighbor beyond family, ethnic, or religious limits. The danger of religious indifference. The priest and the Levite, supposed to be examples of piety, are shown as lacking true compassion. This parable poses a powerful challenge. Are we ready to show compassion beyond our comfort zone? Does our faith translate into concrete acts of love towards those in need? In our modern context, how could we live out this parable? Imagine a person helping a stranger in difficulty, regardless of their origin or religion, or a church engaging with the homeless or refugees in their community, or an individual taking the time to listen to and support a colleague going through a difficult time. The message is clear. True love manifests itself through concrete actions, often costly and uncomfortable. What difference would it make in our world if we all lived according to this principle? As the sun begins to set over the hills of Galilee, let's take a moment to reflect on these three powerful parables. Although different in their details, they converge on common themes: God's surprising grace. Whether in the generosity towards the workers of the last hour, the welcome of the prodigal son, or the compassion of the Samaritan, we see a God whose goodness exceeds our expectations. Unconditional love. These parables show us a love that is not based on merit or performance, but is given freely and generously. Challenge of inclusion. Each parable pushes us to widen our circle of love and compassion, including those we might be tempted to exclude. The call to action. These stories don't leave us in passive contemplation, call us to an active response. Welcome, forgive, help concretely. Imagine for a moment the impact of these teachings on Jesus' first listeners. For many, these words must have been revolutionary, overturning their understanding of God and their relationship with others. And today, 2,000 years later, these parables have lost none of their power. So how can we live out these parables in our daily reality? Let me suggest a few points for reflection and action. Cultivate gratitude. Like the workers of the first hour, we can be tempted to complain about God's generosity towards others. The next time you catch yourself feeling envy or bitterness about someone else's success or blessing, pause. Take a moment to thank God for His goodness to you and choose to rejoice in His grace for others. Practice radical forgiveness. Like the father in the prodigal son parable, be ready to forgive generously, even when it seems unfair. Is there someone in your life you're struggling to forgive? Maybe it's time to take the first step towards reconciliation, even if you feel you're not at fault. Expand your circle of compassion. Like the Good Samaritan, look for opportunities to show love and compassion beyond your comfort. Who are the Samaritans in your life? The people you tend to avoid or judge. How could you reach out to them this week? Act concretely. Don't be content with good intentions. Like the Samaritan, translate your compassion into concrete actions, even if it involves personal cost. Maybe this means giving your time to a neighbor in need, or using your resources to support a cause close to your heart. Examine your prejudices. These parables invite us to question our prejudices about who deserves our love and help. Take a moment to reflect. Are there groups or individuals towards whom you have prejudices? How can you start to see these people through God's eyes? Imagine for a moment the impact we could have if we truly lived according to these principles. Our families, our workplaces, our communities could be transformed. We could be agents of change, bringing a bit of God's kingdom to earth. My dear friends, the parables we've explored today offer us a radical vision of God's love and what it means to live in His kingdom. They challenge us to love as God loves, generously, unconditionally, and actively. Imagine yourself again sitting on that Galilean hill, listening to Jesus conclude His teaching. The sun is setting, bathing the landscape in a golden light. The air is filled with an atmosphere of wonder and challenge. What do you feel? What do you think? I invite you to take a moment to reflect. Which parable touched you the most today? How do these stories transform your understanding of God's love? Which aspect of your life is most challenged by these teachings of Jesus? Remember, these stories are not simply inspiring tales to be listened to passively. They are calls to action, invitations to live different. They call us to love more generously, forgive more radically, to serve more sacrificially. As we conclude our exploration of these parables, I challenge you. Choose one concrete action, inspired by these teachings, you will put into practice this week. Maybe you'll reach out to someone you've judged. Maybe you'll forgive an old offense. Or maybe you'll find a new way to serve your community. Whatever your decision, remember that you're not alone in this endeavor. The same God who calls us to live these profound truths also gives us the strength to put them into practice. His grace precedes us, accompanies us, follows us. As twilight settles over the hills of Galilee, Jesus concludes His teaching. The crowd slowly disperses, each person meditating on the words they've just heard. Some are overwhelmed, others are intrigued, still others are challenged, but no one leaves unchanged. And you, dear listener, as we come to the end of this exploration, how do you leave? Have these parables changed your perspective on God's love? On your relationship with others? On your role in the world? Remember, Jesus' invitation is still current. His call to live in grace, love, and compassion echoes through the centuries to us today. Will we respond to this call? In our next video, we'll explore other powerful teachings of Jesus, including his instructions to the disciples and his sending out of the 12. We'll see how these teachings are in continuity with what we've discovered today, and how they equip us to live as Christ's disciples in our modern world. Until then, may God's grace, love, and compassion accompany you in each of your steps. And don't forget, you are loved with an infinite love, called to an extraordinary life, and equipped to make a difference in this world. Until next time, my friends.